"I am not fit for any man, Mom." Clara Whitcomb said it with her hands still in dishwater. The kitchen of Mrs. Prudence Vale's boarding house smelled of boiled potatoes, old soap, and smoke that had settled into the walls years ago. Outside, the Kansas wind pressed dust against the windows until the glass looked tired. Inside, Clara stood at the sink, with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, scrubbing the same plate longer than she needed to. Mrs. Vale stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. She was not a cruel woman in the loud way. She never shouted, unless a guest broke a lamp or a girl burned bread. Her cruelty was cleaner than that. It came folded in plain words, spoken like weather. "Every girl your age has already gone somewhere," Mrs. Vale said. "Married, hired proper, chosen by somebody. You are 26, Clara. Tell me honestly, are you fit for any man?" Clara's fingers tightened around the plate. The question should not have hurt anymore. Not after all these years. But some words did not pass through a person. They stayed lodged behind the ribs and waited for someone else to touch them. She saw the train platform again. 2 years ago, she had traveled 3 days with one small bag and a letter folded inside her glove. A man in Missouri had placed a marriage notice in the paper. He wanted a steady woman, decent, hardworking, willing to live on a farm and help raise a home from nothing. Clara had believed, foolishly, that such a man might look past a plain dress, tired eyes, and hands rough from work. He had not. He had watched her step down from the train, looked once at her face, then once at the bag in her hand. He did not ask if the journey had been hard. He did not ask her name, though it was written in every letter she had sent. He only laughed under his breath. "You are not what I ordered," he said. "You are not fit for any man." By sunset, Clara was on the return train with her bag on her knees and her shame sitting beside her like another passenger. Now, in Mrs. Vale's kitchen, she dried her hands slowly on her apron. "No, Mom," Clara said. "I suppose I am not fit for any man." Mrs. Vale gave a small nod, satisfied by the answer. "Then you had better start looking for work. This house closes in 2 weeks. My nephew is selling the building." Clara turned toward her. 2 weeks? Maybe less. If the buyer comes early. Mrs. Vale looked around the kitchen, as if Clara were already part of the furniture to be cleared away. "You have always been useful," she added. "I will say that much. But useful is not the same as settled." Then she left. Clara stood alone while the dishwater cooled. She owned 2 dresses, 1 pair of good stockings, a comb with 3 missing teeth, and $17 folded beneath the lining of her small carpet bag. $17 was not a future. It was barely a delay. That evening, after the supper dishes were stacked and the lamps had been turned low, Clara walked to the little white church at the end of Ash Street. The church door was unlocked. It always was. A brass lamp burned near the pulpit, and the room smelled faintly of candle wax, pine boards, and rain that had not yet arrived. Clara did not pray at first. She stood before the bulletin board where notices curled at the corners. A request for a seamstress, a lost mule, a church supper postponed, because the flower wagon had not come. Then her eyes caught on a sheet of paper pinned crookedly near the bottom. The handwriting was rough, as if written by a man too tired to make the letters behave. Widower. 3 children. Need help. Room and board. $10 monthly. Send word to Elias Mercer, Redemption Creek. Clara read it once. Then again 3 children. Not a wife wanted. Not a pretty woman wanted. Not young. Not refined. Not pleasing. Help? The word looked back at her. Something inside Clara shifted, quiet, as a chair being pulled closer to a fire. She thought of children at boarding houses, how they cried different from grown people. Adults cried with pride in the way. Children cried with their whole bodies, until someone came or no one did. She thought of little hands searching for a sleeve, of fevered foreheads, of bedtime fears that could not be reasoned away. of a small weight once held against her chest. Gone now so many years that even grief had learned to whisper. Clara reached up and unpinned the notice. At the telegraph office, the clerk barely looked at her as she counted coins onto the counter. Her message was short because every word cost money. Can come, experienced with children. Will stay if needed. Clara Whitcomb. The clerk tapped it out. Each click sounded like a door opening far away. The next morning, Clara bought a train ticket to Redemption Creek with nearly all she had left. When she stepped onto the platform, dawn was just beginning to silver the rails. Her carpetbag felt lighter than it should have. The wind tugged at the edge of her plain brown hat. Somewhere down the line, the train gave a long, lonely whistle. Clara looked back once at the town that had never truly wanted her. Then she looked ahead. She did not know if Elias Mercer would laugh when he saw her. She did not know if his children would turn away. She did not know if she was walking toward a home or toward one more sentence she would never forget. But she climbed train steps anyway, because maybe she was not fit for any man, but somewhere in Redemption Creek. 3 children needed someone. And Clara Whitcomb still knew how to love. The train reached Redemption Creek late Friday afternoon. Clara Whitcomb stepped down with her carpetbag in one hand and the church notice folded inside her glove. The platform was narrow, sun-bleached, and half-covered in red dust. Beyond it stood a water tower, a freight wagon, and a row of tired horses flicking flies from their backs. For one small moment, no one looked at her. Clara was grateful for that. Then she saw the women. There were 4 of them near the ticket window, all young, bright, and dressed as if the dust itself ought to apologize for touching their hems. One wore a blue traveling dress with pearl buttons. Another had yellow ribbons pinned beneath her hat. A third kept laughing behind her glove, and the 4th looked bored enough to wound a person without speaking. Clara knew their kind. Not wicked, exactly, just certain the world had been arranged with them near the center. At the far end of the platform stood a man beside a wagon. He was tall, but not proud about it. His hat was pulled low, his shirt sleeves rolled, his shoulders bent with the shape of too many days without rest. 3 children stood behind him. The oldest girl looked about 8. She had dark hair braided too tight and eyes that watched everything. Beside her stood a boy of 5, one hand holding the girl's skirt. The smallest child, no more than 3, clutched a rag doll to her chest. Her cheeks were dry, but tears shone on her face as if she had learned to cry without sound. Clara's grip tightened around her bag. The woman in blue walked first. "You must be Mr. Mercer," she said. The man lifted his head. "Elias Mercer, and the wages?" "Room and board," he answered, "and $10 a month." The woman blinked, then laughed once. $10? For 3 children? Another woman stepped forward. "Would I have my own room?" "Yes, with a lock?" Elias nodded. "Of course, and Sundays free?" He hesitated. "The children still need care on Sundays." The yellow-ribboned woman sighed, as if grief were poor housekeeping. "I would need $20, and a clothing allowance. Children ruin good fabric." The third woman looked past him at the children. "Are they difficult?" Elias's jaw tightened. "They lost their mother 4 months ago." The words landed softly, but the children heard them. The boy lowered his eyes. The oldest girl's mouth became a straight, stubborn line. "That is sad," the woman in blue said, "but sadness does not improve the terms." The 4th woman finally spoke, her voice light and sharp. "I came all this way for $10 and motherless children?" Her eyes moved over Elias, then the wagon, then the children. "No, thank you." The others murmured agreement. They turned away together, already smiling again as if they had escaped something unpleasant. Elias did not call after them. He stood very still. The smallest child began to cry harder, still without making much sound. That was what broke Clara. Not the rejection, not the women's laughter. The quiet crying. She stepped forward before fear could stop her. Mr. Mercer? He turned. Clara felt his eyes take her in, her plain brown dress, her old hat, her work-worn hands, the bag that held almost nothing. She waited for the familiar change in his face, the disappointment, the quick measuring, the polite retreat. It did not come. I am Clara Whitcomb, she said. I sent the telegram. Behind her, one of the women gave a small laugh. Clara knew that laugh too, Lydia Crane. The woman in blue looked her up and down. You? The word hit harder than it should have. Clara's face warmed, but she kept her eyes on Elias. I know what I look like, she said quietly, and I know I am not what most men hope to see when they wait at a train platform. The station seemed to still around her. Lydia's smile sharpened. Clara swallowed. I am not fit for any man, sir. I have been told that plainly enough. Elias does not move. Clara looked past him at the children. At the oldest girl, pretending not to care. At the boy holding on because he had nothing else to do. At the little one whose tears had finally slipped into small, broken breaths. But I can love your children, Clara said. I can cook for them. Wash for them. Sit beside them when they are afraid. I can learn what each of them needs. I can stay when staying is hard. The wind dragged dust across the boards. No one laughed now. Elias looked at her for a long moment. His face did not soften exactly. It was too tired for that. But something in his eyes changed, like a lamp being turned low instead of blown out. Then he asked, Will you stay? Clara's breath caught. Yes, she said. I will stay. Elias turned to the smallest child. Mabel, he said gently. The little girl looked up at him. He lifted her with careful arms, then placed her against Clara's shoulder, as if handing over something breakable and precious. Mabel stiffened at first. Then her small fingers caught Clara's collar. Her face pressed into Clara's neck, and the sob she had been holding came out at last. Clara closed her arms around her. Not too tight. Not too fast. Just enough to tell the child she would not be dropped. This is Nora, Elias said, nodding to the oldest. And Caleb. Nora stared at Clara as if trying to decide whether hope was dangerous. Caleb whispered, Hello, hello, Clara said. I'm Miss Clara. Lydia Crane made a soft sound of disgust and walked away with the others. Elias picked up Clara's carpet bag. He did not comment on how light it was. The ranch is an hour out, he said. They have not eaten since morning. Then we should go, Clara answered. As the wagon rolled away from Redemption Creek, Clara held Mabel in her lap. Caleb sat close but not touching. Nora kept her eyes on the road ahead. The town fell behind them. The land opened wide, red and gold beneath the sinking sun. Clara did not know yet whether this road led to a home, but for the first time in years, someone had asked her to stay. The Mercer Ranch appeared over a low hill just as the sun began to sink. At first, Clara saw the shape of a good place. A solid barn, a windmill turning slowly in the dry evening air. A house made of weathered boards, its roof patched but standing strong against the wide Kansas sky. Then the wagon drew closer, and she saw what grief had done. Laundry hung stiff on the porch rail, forgotten too long in the dust. The garden had gone wild, weeds climbing through the old bean poles. A bucket lay tipped near the well. Chickens scratched loose around the steps as if no one had had the heart to put them back where they belonged. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop. It is not much, he said. Clara shifted Mabel gently in her lap. The little girl had fallen asleep against her, one damp cheek pressed to Clara's collar. It is not bad, Clara said. It is tired. Elias looked at her then, quickly, as if the answer had touched a place he kept covered. Inside, the house smelled of ashes, stale bread, and children who had been fed but not comforted. Dishes filled the sink. Dust gathered along the windowsills. A small boot lay under the table. A rag doll sat face down near the hearth, but Clara saw the bones of the place. Wide windows, strong beams, a stone fireplace, a table big enough for elbows, schoolbooks, and Sunday biscuits. A home was still here. It was only buried. Elias carried Mabel to a small bed near the fireplace, then showed Clara a narrow room off the kitchen. It was built for a hired hand, he said, not much comfort. There was a cot, a washstand, and one square window looking toward the barn. On the inside of the door, the lock had been newly fixed. Clara noticed the fresh scrape marks around the latch. Elias saw her looking. "I thought you should have a door that closes proper." For a moment, Clara could not answer. "Thank you," she said. When she turned, Nora stood in the hall. The girl's arms were folded tight across her chest. Her dark braid hung over one shoulder, neat but pulled too hard. "You won't stay," Nora said. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Clara knelt so. She was not looking down at the child. "I said I would." That is what the last one said. Clara felt the weight of that. How many have there been? Nora's mouth trembled, but only for half a second. 5. 5 women in 4 months. No wonder the child stood like a locked door. "I understand if you do not believe me," Clara said. "You do not have to trust me tonight." "I won't. That is all right." Nora frowned, as if kindness annoyed her more than anger. Clara added, "You only have to let me try." Nora did not answer. She turned and walked away, her small boots hard against the floorboards. That night, after the children had eaten beans and cornbread, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen. The dishes looked impossible, so she rolled up her sleeves. She washed one plate, then another. She scrubbed the iron pan, wiped the table, shook crumbs from the cloth, swept dust into a neat gray pile by the door. Work steadied her. It always had. When her thoughts grew too loud, her hands knew how to keep living. An hour later, Elias came in from the barn. He stopped at the threshold. "You did not have to do all that. I know. I hired you for the children." Clara placed another cup on the drying towel. A dirty kitchen frightens children more than grown people think. Elias said nothing. Then he took a towel from the peg and began drying beside her. They worked without speaking. Plate, cup, spoon, silence. Outside, the wind dragged dry grass along the walls. Inside, the house slowly remembered the sound of order. When the last dish was set away, Elias poured coffee into 2 cups. He placed one near Clara, without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around the warmth. Nora watched, order, unseen by both of them. 2 weeks passed like that. Not easily, not sweetly, but steadily. Mabel stopped flinching when Clara touched her hair. Caleb began following her through the kitchen, asking small questions in a voice barely louder than the stove fire. Did biscuits need salt? Could chickens dream? Did his mama know how to make apple butter? Clara answered what she could. Nora answered nothing. She dressed Mabel before Clara woke. She cut Caleb's bread too thick. She carried water with both hands, spilling half of it before she reached the door. If Clara offered help, Nora refused it before the offer was finished. One morning, Clara found her in the chicken coop, trying to mend a broken nesting box. The hammer was too large for her hand. The nail bent twice. On the 3rd try, Nora missed and struck her thumb. She gasped, but did not cry. Clara knelt in the straw. "I can help. I don't need help." "No," Clara said softly. "But the box might." Nora glared at her. Clara picked up a straight nail and held it out. "Your mama taught you to take care of things, didn't she?" Nora's face closed. "Don't talk about mama." "All right." The silence stretched. Then Clara said, "Will you teach me something instead?" Nora blinked. "What?" "How Caleb likes his eggs. I keep getting them wrong." For the first time, Nora looked less angry than confused. "You want me to teach you? You know them better than anyone." Nora looked down at the bent nail in her palm. "He likes them scrambled," she said at last. "Not wet. Not brown either." "That sounds difficult." "It is," Nora said. And then, just for a second, she almost smiled. That afternoon, Nora came into the kitchen carrying a wooden comb. It was small, smooth from years of use, with a rose carved into the handle. Clara knew at once it had not belonged to the children. Mabel stood behind Nora, rubbing her eyes with one fist. Her dark hair was loose around her face, tangled from a nap. "She won't sleep right if her hair is down," Nora said. Clara dried her hands on her apron. "Do you want me to braid it?" Nora looked at the comb. Then, at Clara. Mama always did it. The kitchen grew very still. Clara did not reach for the comb. "Then you had better show me how she did it." Nora's eyes changed. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. "You want me to show you?" "Yes," Clara said. "I do not know her way." They sat on the porch as the evening cooled. Mabel settled between Clara's knees, sleepy and warm, while Nora stood beside them with the comb held carefully in both hands. "Start here," Nora said, touching the crown of Mabel's head. "Mama made 3 parts, not 2. 3. Clara followed slowly. "No," Nora said, "too loose." Clara undid the braid and began again. This time, Nora's small fingers guided hers. Over, under, pull gentle, not tight. The comb moved through Mabel's hair, with soft wooden sounds. Caleb sat on the steps nearby, pretending to whittle a stick with a dull table knife while watching every movement. When the braid was halfway done, Nora began to hum. It was so quiet Clara almost missed it. The tune rose and fell like wind over dry grass. A lullaby, old and tender. Nora stopped after a few notes, her mouth pressing shut. Clara did not ask her to continue. She only hummed the last note back. Nora looked at her. "You don't know the words." "No," Clara said. "But I can hold the tune until you remember them." For a long moment, Nora said nothing. Then she began again. "Little mockingbird, fold your wing." Her voice broke before the second line. Clara hummed beneath her, steady and low. Caleb joined after a while, barely loud enough to hear. Mabel leaned back against Clara and closed her eyes. From the barn doorway, Elias watched. He stood there with a bridle in one hand, not moving, as if the song had pinned him to the earth. That night, Caleb asked the question. They were sitting near the fireplace. Clara was mending one of his shirts. Elias sat at the table, looking over a list of supplies he had not truly been reading. Caleb stared into the low flames. "Miss Clara? Yes? Can a body miss Mama and like you too?" The needle stopped in Clara's hand. Nora looked up fast. Elias's face tightened, but he did not speak. Clara folded the shirt in her lap. "I think love is not like a chair," she said carefully. "One person sitting down does not mean another has to stand." Caleb frowned, thinking hard. "So Mama still has her place?" "Yes," Clara said. "Always." Mabel, half asleep against Nora's side, whispered. Mama rose. At the name, Elias pushed his chair back. The sound was not loud, but everyone felt it. "I need to check the horses," he said. He went out before anyone could answer. Later, Clara found him in the barn, standing beside the empty stall where the children's mother had once kept a gray mare. The lantern hung low. Dust moved through the light like tiny pieces of memory. "You left when Mabel said her name?" Clara said. Elias kept his back to her. "I heard. She is 3, Clara said. She should not have to learn which words break her father." His shoulders stiffened. "That is not fair." "No," Clara said softly. "It is not." He turned then, tiredness carved deep around his eyes. "You think I do not remember her every hour of every day? I think you remember her so hard that the children have to forget her out loud." Elias looked away. For a while, only the horses breathed in the dark. Clara stepped closer, but not too close. "Say her name." His jaw worked. "Clara. Say it once where the children can hear you and not be afraid." The lantern flame flickered. Elias lowered his head. "Rose," he said. The name came out rough, almost broken. Clara felt tears rise, but she held them back. This was not her grief to take. The next Sunday, after church, Elias did not turn the wagon toward home. He drove past the schoolhouse, past the dry creek bed, and up the small hill where the cemetery looked over Redemption Creek. The children grew quiet when they understood. Rose Mercer's grave stood beneath a cottonwood tree. The marker was simple, clean. Elias had kept that much tended, even when the house had fallen apart. Nora held Mabel's hand. Caleb carried a bunch of yellow wildflowers crushed in his fist. Clara stayed several steps behind them. Elias knelt first. "Rose," he said, and this time his children heard him. Nora began to cry without hiding her face. Caleb put the flowers down. Mabel touched the carved letters with one small finger. Clara turned away toward the wide land and let the family have its sorrow. That evening, back at the ranch, Nora asked Clara to hum the Mockingbird song again. Elias joined on the second line. His voice was low and unsteady, but it was there. A dry wind moved through the kitchen. The white curtain beside the stove lifted once, then settled, though the window was barely open. For one breath, the room smelled faintly of wildflowers and clean cotton. No one said anything about it. Mabel fell asleep with her braid against Clara's arm. Nora leaned against her father's knee, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, the house did not feel as though it was waiting for someone to come back. It felt as someone had given it permission to keep living. The trouble began at the schoolhouse. Clara had walked there with Nora and Caleb on a clear Monday morning, Mabel on her hip, and a basket of biscuits in her free hand. The road into Redemption Creek was dry and rutted, with wagon tracks hardened in the red dirt. Cottonwood leaves rattled in the wind like old paper. Nora walked beside Clara, not quite touching her, but close enough that her sleeve brushed Clara's apron now and then. That alone felt like a miracle. Miss Eliza Pruitt met them at the schoolhouse door. "Nora," she said warmly, "your sums have improved." Nora looked down, trying not to smile. "Miss Clara helped me after supper," she said. The teacher's eyes moved to Clara with quiet kindness. "Then Miss Clara is doing fine work." For one bright moment, Clara let herself believe the world might allow it. Then Mr. Silas Vane stepped out from behind the schoolhouse. He was one of the school trustees, a narrow man with polished boots and a watch chain he touched whenever he wished to sound important. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. "Miss Whitcomb?" Clara corrected softly. His mouth tightened. "Yes, that is the trouble, is it not?" Miss Pruitt stiffened. "Mr. Vane?" He ignored her. "People are talking. A woman not related by blood or marriage, living out at a widower's ranch, acting as mother to his children, riding into church beside him every Sunday." Clark felt Nora's hand find the edge of her skirt. "I have my own room," Clara said, "with a lock." "That may satisfy you," Mr. Vane replied. "It does not satisfy the town." Nora stepped forward. "She takes care of us." Mr. Vane's face changed, but not with cruelty, with pity. "That made it worse. Child, sometimes grown people must protect children from what they cannot yet understand." Clara took Nora's hand. "Come along," she said. But the words followed her, all the way back to the ranch. "People are talking." By evening, Elias knew something was wrong. He found Clara folding laundry on the porch, with Mabel asleep against the bench, and Caleb sorting clothespins by size. What did Vane say? Clara did not ask how he knew. "That my being here harms the children." Elias's expression darkened, but his voice stayed controlled. "You know that is not true." "I know what is true inside this house," Clara said. "I do not know what truth becomes once other people start carrying it." The next afternoon, 3 riders came up the road. Elias saw them first from the barn and crossed the yard before they reached the porch. Clara stood in the doorway, with Mabel behind her skirt. Nora came out of the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. Caleb stayed near the table, very still. Judge Amos Bell climbed down slowly. Beside him stood Sheriff Harlan Pike and Mr. Vane. The judge removed his hat. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "Miss Whitcomb, we have received complaints." Elias kept his hands visible at his sides. From whom? Concerned citizens. That is a name cowards use when they want to stay hidden. Judge Bell's jaw tightened. I did not come here to trade insults. I came to see whether these children are being kept in a proper household. Clara opened the door wider. Then, come in. The judge looked through the rooms. He saw clean floors, bread cooling on the table, school slates stacked neatly near the hearth, Mabel's doll tucked under a blanket. He saw Nora's mended dress, Caleb's washed hair, Elias's repaired shelves, but he also saw Clara's room off the kitchen. And he saw no wedding ring on her hand. He asked the children questions. Did they eat? Yes. Did Miss Clara strike them? No. Did she sleep in her own room? Yes. Did they call her mother? At that, the room went silent. Mabel began to cry. Clara knelt beside her, but did not touch her until Mabel reached first. Judge Bell looked away, uncomfortable but unmoved. This arrangement cannot continue, he said at last. Miss Whitcomb must leave this ranch within 48 hours. Elias's voice dropped. And if she does not, then the court will consider temporary removal of the children until a proper household can be established. Nora made a sound like something breaking. Elias stepped closer to the judge, but Clara touched his arm, not to stop him from anger, to remind him of the children watching. After the men left, the house seemed to shrink around them. That night, Elias found Clara in the kitchen. I will marry you, he said. Clara closed her eyes. Do not say it like a fence you need to mend. That is not what I meant. Then say what you mean. He stood there in the lamplight, tired and honest and afraid. I mean that I love you, he said. I mean this house breathes when you are in it. I mean my children look for you before they look for me some mornings, and I should resent that. But I thank God for it. Clara's hand shook against the table. I love you too, she whispered. Then stay. But before dawn, Clara packed her carpet bag. She told herself it was love. She told herself leaving would protect them. She had one hand on the door when Nora's voice came from the hall. You promised. Clara turned. Nora stood barefoot in her nightdress. Caleb was behind her, holding Mabel's hand. Mabel's lower lip trembled. Don't go, Mama Clara. The name struck Clara straight through the heart. Nora's eyes filled, but she did not look away. If you leave so they do not take us, she said, then they still take you. Clara sank to her knees. The children came to her all at once. Outside, the first light touched the barn roof. Inside, Clara held them and understood the terrible truth. Leaving could be another kind of abandonment. And staying might cost them everything. Would you leave to protect the children from scandal, or stay and risk everything, so they never learn that love means abandonment? Tell me what you would choose. By Sunday morning, the whole town knew. No one had to ring a bell for the hearing. People came, because people always came, when another family's sorrow could be dressed up as concern. The church was full before the service ended. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men stood near the back with their hats pressed against their chests. Sunlight came through the plain glass windows, falling in pale squares across the wooden floor. Clara sat beside Elias. Nora sat on her other side holding Caleb's hand. Mabel was in Elias's lap, her cheek resting against his vest. Judge Amos Bells stood near the pulpit. This is not a trial, he said, but it felt like one. His eyes moved over the room. The matter before us is whether the Mercer children are living in a proper household. Miss Clara Whitcomb has been residing at Mr. Mercer's ranch as a hired caretaker. There are concerns about the arrangement. A murmur moved through the church. Elias stood. I will speak first. Judge Bell nodded. Elias turned toward the town, not with anger, but with the weariness of a man who had finally stopped hiding. When Rose died, he said, I kept my children fed. I kept the roof patched. I kept the animals alive. I thought that meant I was holding the house together. His voice roughened. But my daughter Nora stopped being a little girl. Caleb stopped asking questions because every answer hurt. Mabel cried without making noise, because she had learned no one knew what to do with her tears. Clara looked down, fighting her own. Then Clara came. Elias said. She did not take Rose's place. No one can. She washed dishes. She learned how Caleb liked his eggs. She let Nora teach her how Rose braided Mabel's hair. She stood back at Rose's grave and let us grieve without trying to own it. The room had gone silent. She did not damage my children, Elias said. She helped them breathe. Judge Bell's face did not soften, but his eyes lowered. Monsieur Swain stood next. I do not doubt Miss Whitcomb has been useful, he said. But usefulness is not the same as propriety. Before Elias could answer, Nora rose. She was small in the wide church. Her braid was neat, tied with a brown ribbon Clara had mended the night before. I want to speak, Nora said. Judge Bell hesitated. Miss Eliza Pruitt stood from the second pew. Let the child speak. Nora stepped into the aisle. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. When Mama died, I thought I had to be her, she said. I dressed Mabel. I watched Caleb. I tried to remember everything Mama did so nobody would know how scared I was. Caleb began to cry quietly. Nora looked at him, then back at the town. Miss Clara did not come and say she was our mother. She's me to teach her. She let me remember Mama without making it hurt worse. Her eyes found Clara. She gave Mama back to us. That was when Mrs. Prudence Vale stood near the back. Clara's breath caught the boarding house. Matron looked older in the church light. I knew Miss Whitcomb in Abilene Crossing. Mrs. Vale said, I told her once she was not fit for any man. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I was wrong, Mrs. Vale continued. And worse, I was proud of being wrong. Some women are not chosen because they lack worth. Some are passed over because the world is too blind to recognize quiet strength. Clara covered her mouth with one hand. Miss Pruitt spoke next. She told the town how Nora's schoolwork had improved, how Caleb had started reading aloud, how Mabel no longer hid behind benches when adults spoke. Finally, Judge Bell turned to Clara, Miss Whitcomb. Do you wish to say anything? Clara stood slowly. I came to Redemption Creek because I had $17 and nowhere else to go, she said. I thought I could love these children even if no one ever loved me. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. But they loved me before I knew how to believe it. And if loving them has made me improper in your eyes, then I cannot make myself sorry for it. Mabel slid from Elias's lap and ran to Clara, wrapping both arms around her skirt. Mama Clara, she whispered. The church heard it. Judge Bell closed his ledger. I will withdraw the complaint, he said. The children are clearly cared for. Relief moved through the room like wind through wheat. Then Elias stepped into the aisle. Clara, she turned. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. I asked once if you would stay, he said. Today I am asking if you will let me stay with you. Not because the judge requires it. Not because the town needs a cleaner story. Because I love you. Because my children chose you. Because I choose you too. Clara looked at Nora. Nora nodded through tears. Caleb smiled. Mabel held tighter to Clara's dress. Yes, Clara said. I will. The wedding was small. There were no fine flowers, no polished silver, no grand music. Only the church bell, a plain white ribbon in Clara's hair, and 3 children standing close enough to touch her skirt. After the vows, Nora came forward with both hands closed around something. Clara knelt. Nora opened her palms. Rose's wooden comb lay there, the little carved rose worn smooth by years of use. Mama used this for us, Nora said, but I think she would want you to keep it where we can find it. Clara could not speak, so she took the comb carefully, as if it were made of breath and memory. I will never use it to take her place, Clara whispered. Nora leaned forward and put her arms around Clara's neck. I know, she said. That is why it belongs with you. 6 months later, the Mercer ranch no longer looked tired. Beans climbed the garden poles. Fresh linens moved on the porch line. Caleb read beneath the cottonwood while Nora corrected him gently. Mabel slept in the shade with Rose's old wooden comb beside her. Clara stood on the porch with Elias beside her. The wind carried the smell of bread, dust, and wildflowers. Caleb looked up from his book. "Tell us again how you came here." Clara smiled. "I came because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I stayed because you loved me first." Elias took her hand, and the house, once buried under grief, stood warm beneath the wide western sky. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.